Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of person who prepared for everything. At 28, she worked as a social worker in downtown Chicago, carrying a large canvas bag that seemed to hold half her life. Her colleagues often joked about the mysterious contents of that bag, but Sarah just smiled and changed the subject. The morning started like any other Tuesday. Sarah grabbed her usual coffee from the corner shop and headed to the Greyhound station for her monthly trip to visit her elderly aunt in Milwaukee. The bus was crowded, filled with the usual mix of business travelers, students, and families. Sarah found a seat near the middle and settled in for the 3-hour journey. About an hour into the trip, the bus pulled over at a rest stop. As passengers filed out to stretch their legs and grab snacks, Sarah decided to stay in her seat and catch up on some paperwork. She pulled out a thick folder from her bag and spread the documents across the empty seat beside her. That's when she noticed the commotion near the front of the bus. 2 security officers had boarded and were speaking with the driver. Their voices were low, but the tension was obvious. Other passengers started whispering among themselves, craning their necks to see what was happening. One of the officers, a tall man with graying hair, walked down the aisle with purpose. His partner, a younger woman with sharp eyes, followed behind. They stopped at random seats, asking passengers to open their bags for inspection. Sarah's stomach tightened as she watched them work their way toward her section. The reason for the search became clear when the older officer announced that there had been a theft at the previous stop. Someone had reported a missing wallet containing several $100s and important identification cards. The thief was believed to be on this bus, and they needed to check everyone's belongings. Sarah gathered her papers and slipped them back into her folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized her bag. She had nothing to hide, but the idea of strangers going through her personal belongings made her uncomfortable. The bag contained more than just work documents and everyday items. It held pieces of her life that she kept private for good reasons. When the officers reached her row, Sarah looked up with what she hoped was a calm expression. The female officer smiled politely and asked Sarah to step into the aisle. The male officer gestured toward her bag. "We need to take a look inside, ma'am. It's just routine. We're checking everyone." Sarah nodded and handed over her bag, trying to ignore the curious stares from nearby passengers. Several people had their phones out, some clearly recording the entire process. The thought of her private belongings being displayed for entertainment made her feel sick. The officers began their search methodically. They pulled out her work files first, flipping through case notes and reports. Sarah watched as they examined her laptop, charger, and the small bag containing her medications. So far, nothing unusual had appeared. But then, the female officer reached deeper into the bag and pulled out something that made several passengers gasp. It was a thick envelope, and when she opened it, dozens of $20 bills spilled onto the seat. The officer quickly counted the money while her partner watched Sarah's face carefully. "That's $460. The officer announced loudly enough for half the bus to hear. "Can you explain why you're carrying this much cash?" Sarah felt the weight of everyone's stares. She could hear whispered conversations starting around her. Someone behind her muttered something about looking suspicious. The phone cameras seemed to zoom in closer. "It's my own money," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried in the silent bus. "I can explain." The officers exchanged a look. The older one pulled out a small notebook and pen. "We're going to need more than that, ma'am. This matches the amount reported stolen." Sarah's face flushed red. She could feel her heart racing as she realized how bad this looked. A young woman traveling alone with a large sum of cash, right after a theft had been reported. The coincidence was damning. But the search wasn't over. The female officer continued digging through the bag and pulled out something else that made the situation even more complicated. It was a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be jewelry, rings, a necklace, and a pair of expensive-looking earrings. "And these?" the officer asked, holding up the bag for everyone to see. Sarah's mouth went dry. She knew exactly how this appeared to everyone watching. A bag full of cash and jewelry right after a theft. The murmurs from other passengers grew louder. Someone called out that they should just arrest her and get moving. "Those aren't stolen," Sarah said, her voice stronger now despite her nervousness. "Everything in that bag belongs to me, and I can prove it." The male officer raised an eyebrow. You can prove you own $400 in cash. Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment she had hoped to avoid, but there was no choice now. Her reputation, her job, and possibly her freedom depended on what happened next. Yes, I can prove it. But first, you need to keep looking in the bag. There's something else in there that will explain everything. The officers looked at each other again, then back at Sarah. The female officer reached into the bag once more, this time pulling out a small leather portfolio. She opened it and found several official-looking documents inside. "What are these?" she asked, scanning the papers. Sarah straightened her shoulders and looked directly at both officers. "Those are receipts and documentation for everything you found. The cash, the jewelry, all of it. But that's not the important part." She paused, knowing that what she said next would change everything. Not just for this situation, but for her carefully maintained privacy. "Look at the ID card in that portfolio. It will tell you exactly why I have those things, and why your theft report doesn't make any sense." The officer pulled out a laminated card and examined it closely. Her expression changed immediately. She showed the card to her partner, whose eyes widened in surprise. The card identified Sarah as a licensed private investigator, specializing in missing persons cases. But that wasn't the most shocking part. Attached to the card was a current case file with photos and documentation that would explain everything in her bag. Sarah had been hoping to keep her second job secret from her coworkers and friends. Being a social worker was her passion, but private investigation work helped pay off her student loans and support her aunt's medical expenses. She took cases that aligned with her values, finding missing teenagers, locating deadbeat parents who owed child support, helping families reconnect with lost relatives. The cash and jewelry weren't stolen goods. They were evidence from an active case involving a teenager who had run away from an abusive home situation. Sarah had been tracking the girl's movements and had recovered these items from a pawn shop where the desperate teenager had sold them for food money. As the officers read through her case file, Sarah watched the expressions of the nearby passengers change from suspicion to curiosity. The phones were still recording, but now people seemed interested in a different kind of story. "This changes things," the female officer said quietly. "But we still need to verify this information." Sarah nodded, understanding their position. "Call my supervisor at the agency. Her number is in the file. She'll confirm everything and can provide additional documentation about the case." While one officer made the phone call, Sarah found herself thinking about the teenager she was trying to help. 15-year-old Maya had been missing for 3 weeks. Her foster family claimed she was a troublemaker who had probably run away to cause problems, but Sarah's investigation had revealed a much darker truth. Maya hadn't run away because she was rebellious. She had fled because her foster father had been abusing her, and when she tried to report it, no one believed her. The system that was supposed to protect her had failed, just like it had failed so many other kids Sarah had worked with over the years. The jewelry and cash weren't just evidence in a case file. They represented a young girl's desperate attempt to survive on the streets rather than endure another day of abuse. Sarah had found Maya 3 days ago, living in an abandoned building with 2 other runaway teens. Getting Maya to trust her enough to accept help had taken patience and careful relationship building. The phone call was taking longer than expected. Sarah could see other passengers getting restless. Some were openly complaining about the delay, saying they had important appointments to keep. Others seemed fascinated by the drama and appeared to be hoping for more excitement. One middle-aged woman in the seat across from Sarah leaned forward and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't care what kind of investigator she claims to be. Good people don't carry around bags full of cash and jewelry. There's something fishy about this whole story." Several other passengers murmured their agreement. Sarah felt the familiar sting of judgment that came with her line of work. People always assumed the worst when they didn't understand the full situation. A young man near the back of the bus called out, "Maybe she's one of those fake investigators you see on TV. You know, the ones who scam people out of their money by pretending to find missing relatives." Sarah's face burned with embarrassment and frustration. These strangers were making assumptions about her character based on 30 seconds of observation. They had no idea about the late nights she spent following leads, the dangerous neighborhoods she entered to find missing kids, or the emotional toll of dealing with family tragedies on a daily basis. The female officer finally finished her phone call and walked back to where Sarah was standing. Her expression was unreadable as she approached. "I spoke with your supervisor," she said in a voice that carried to the nearby passengers. "She confirmed your identity and the details of your current case." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she could tell from the officer's tone that there was more to come. "However, there are some complications with your story that we need to discuss." Sarah's relief turned to confusion as the officer continued speaking. The bus had grown completely silent now, with every passenger straining to hear what would happen next. "Your supervisor confirmed that you're working the Maya Rodriguez case," the officer said carefully. "But she also mentioned something interesting. She said you weren't supposed to have physical evidence in your possession. All recovered items should have been turned over to the police department yesterday." The bottom dropped out of Sarah's stomach. She had been so focused on proving she wasn't a thief that she hadn't considered how her deviation from protocol would look. The truth was more complicated than a simple case explanation. "I can explain that too," Sarah said, though her voice was less confident now. "The situation with Maya required some flexibility in how we handled the evidence." The male officer stepped closer. "What kind of flexibility?" Sarah glanced around at the sea of curious faces watching her every move. This was definitely not how she had planned to spend her morning, and certainly not how she wanted to discuss the sensitive details of an active case involving a minor. "Maya is terrified of the police," Sarah began slowly. "She's been let down by the system before. When I found her, she only agreed to help recover her belongings if I promised she wouldn't have to face a bunch of officers asking her questions right away." The female officer frowned. "So you decided to hold on to evidence in an active case because a teenager asked you to?" Put like that, it sounded terrible. Sarah knew she had bent the rules, but she also knew it was the only way to gain Maya's trust. Without that trust, the girl would have disappeared back into the streets, and they might never have found her again. "It's more complicated than that," Sarah said, aware that she was digging herself deeper into trouble. "Maya isn't just afraid of police. She's afraid of all authority figures because the last time she trusted the system, it sent her back to an abusive home." An elderly man near the front of the bus spoke up loudly. "So you're saying you're above the law? That you can just ignore police procedures because you think you know better?" Other passengers began voicing their opinions. Some agreed that Sarah seemed to be making excuses for breaking rules. Others argued that helping a scared kid was more important than following bureaucratic procedures. The bus was turning into a debate hall, with Sarah standing in the middle as the main topic of discussion. The officers were clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the situation. The female officer made a decision to take control. "We need to continue this conversation off the bus," she announced. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with us to sort this out properly." Sarah's heart sank. She could see her fellow passengers already pulling out their phones to record her being escorted off the bus. By evening, she would probably be featured in social media posts with captions about suspicious people and mysterious bag searches. But as she began gathering her scattered belongings, something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the bus called out clearly, "Wait a minute. I think I know who she is." Everyone turned to see who had spoken. A woman in her 40s with graying hair and kind eyes stood up from her seat. She was holding a newspaper clipping in her hand. "Are you Sarah Martinez? The investigator who found those missing twins last month?" Sarah looked up in surprise. She recognized the woman vaguely, but couldn't place where they had met. "I'm Rebecca Chun," the woman continued, walking forward through the aisle. "My daughter goes to Lincoln Elementary. You found the Morrison twins when the police had given up looking for them. You saved those children's lives." The mood on the bus shifted dramatically as Rebecca continued talking. She told the other passengers about how the Morrison twins, ages 6 and 8, had disappeared from a playground. The police had searched for days but had no leads. The children's desperate parents had hired Sarah as a last resort. She found them locked in the basement of their own babysitter's house, Rebecca explained to the captivated audience. The babysitter's boyfriend had taken them, planning to demand ransom money. If Sarah hadn't followed up on a tiny detail the police missed, those babies would be dead right now. Sarah felt overwhelmed as Rebecca painted her as some kind of hero. The reality of that case had been much messier and scarier than Rebecca's retelling suggested. Sarah had spent 3 sleepless days following false leads and had only found the children because of a lucky break involving a neighbor's security camera. But Rebecca wasn't finished. She turned to address the officers directly. If this woman bent some rules to help a scared teenager, then maybe you should ask yourselves why your system is so broken that she had to bend them in the first place. The female officer looked uncomfortable, but maintained her professional demeanor. We appreciate the character reference, ma'am, but we still have protocols to follow. Of course you do, Rebecca replied firmly. But maybe you should also consider that someone with her track record deserves the benefit of the doubt while you sort out the details. Other passengers began speaking up, sharing their own thoughts about the situation. A young mother mentioned how terrified her own daughter would be if she had to face police questioning after being abused. An older gentleman talked about how red tape often prevented good people from doing the right thing. Sarah found herself in the strange position of having a bus full of strangers debate her character and methods. Part of her appreciated the support, but she also felt exposed and vulnerable having her work discussed so publicly. The male officer made a phone call to his supervisor, stepping outside the bus for privacy. While he was gone, Sarah tried to explain her situation more clearly to the remaining officer and the interested passengers. Maya has been failed by the system multiple times, she said, choosing her words carefully. Her biological parents were drug addicts who abused her. Her first foster family sent her back after 3 months, claiming she was too difficult. Her second placement was where the sexual abuse started. The bus grew quiet as Sarah continued. When she reported the abuse, the caseworker didn't believe her. They said she was making up stories to get attention. So she ran away, and everyone assumed she was just another troubled kid who couldn't handle structure. Rebecca nodded knowingly. How did you find out the truth? I talked to her, Sarah said simply. I listened to her story without judging her. I investigated her claims instead of dismissing them. It took me 2 weeks to gather enough evidence to prove that her foster father had been abusing not just Maya, but 2 other girls who had lived in that house. The female officer looked up from her notebook where she had been taking notes. And the jewelry and cash? Sarah sighed. Maya had stolen those items from her foster family before she ran away. Not because she's a thief, but because she knew she would need money to survive on the streets. She pawned everything except those few pieces, which she kept because they belonged to her biological grandmother. So why didn't you turn everything over to the police immediately? The officer pressed. Because Maya begged me not to. She was terrified that if police got involved right away, they would put her in another foster home while they investigated. She couldn't handle the thought of being placed somewhere else where she might face more abuse. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her. I promised her I would hold on to her grandmother's jewelry until we could find her a safe place to stay. I was planning to turn everything over today after I got back from visiting my aunt. The male officer returned to the bus and had a quiet conversation with his partner. Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language suggested they were reaching some kind of decision. Finally, the female officer approached Sarah again. We've spoken with our supervisor and with your boss. Given the circumstances and your clean record, we're going to allow you to continue your journey. However, you need to turn over all evidence to the appropriate authorities within 24 hours. Sarah nodded gratefully. Of course, I understand. As the officers prepared to leave the bus, Rebecca stood up again. What about the original theft report? Did you find the real thief? The male officer looked embarrassed. Actually, we just received word that the theft victim found his wallet. It had fallen between his car seats. There was no theft after all. A collective groan went up from the passengers. All of this drama had been based on a false report. Sarah felt a mix of relief and frustration. Her privacy had been invaded and her professional reputation questioned because someone couldn't be bothered to check his car thoroughly before reporting a crime. But as the officers left and the bus driver prepared to resume the journey, Sarah realized something important had happened. The forced explanation of her work had actually created an opportunity to educate people about the realities facing missing and exploited children. Rebecca approached her as other passengers returned to their seats. I meant what I said about the Morrison twins. My whole neighborhood was talking about how you never gave up when everyone else said it was hopeless. Sarah smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. Thank you. That case was actually what convinced me to take on Maya's situation. Sometimes kids need someone who will believe them when no one else will. As the bus pulled back onto the highway, Sarah noticed that several passengers were still looking at her with interest rather than suspicion. A teenage girl across the aisle had been listening to the entire conversation, and she approached Sarah hesitantly. "Excuse me," the girl said quietly. "Can I ask you something about your job?" The teenage girl looked nervous as she sat down in the empty seat next to Sarah. She appeared to be around 16, with dark hair and worried eyes that seemed older than her years. "My name is Jessica," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I heard what you said about Maya, and about how you help kids who aren't believed by the system." Sarah studied the girl's face, recognizing the careful way she was choosing her words. After years of working with troubled teenagers, Sarah had developed an instinct for spotting kids who needed help but were afraid to ask for it directly. "What's on your mind, Jessica?" Sarah asked gently. Jessica fidgeted with her backpack straps, clearly struggling with whether to continue the conversation. "I have this friend," she began, using the classic way teenagers talked about themselves when they weren't ready to admit they needed help. "She's in a really bad situation at home, but every time she tries to tell someone, they don't take her seriously." Sarah nodded, encouraging Jessica to continue without pressuring her. She had learned that pushing too hard too fast could make scared kids shut down completely. "What kind of situation?" Sarah asked. "Her stepdad," Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hits her mom, and lately he's been paying too much attention to my friend." But when she tried to tell her school counselor, they said she was probably just having trouble adjusting to her mom's new marriage. Sarah's heart sank. This was exactly the kind of situation that made her work both necessary and heartbreaking. Too often, adults dismiss teenagers' concerns as drama or attention-seeking behavior, missing serious signs of abuse. "How old is your friend?" Sarah asked. 16. "Same as me." Jessica paused, then added, "She's thinking about running away, but she doesn't want to leave her little brother alone with that man." This detail made Sarah even more concerned. A 16-year-old girl worried about protecting a younger sibling was a classic pattern in abuse situations. Often, older children stayed in dangerous homes specifically to shield their younger brothers and sisters. "Jessica," Sarah said carefully, "does your friend know that there are people who would believe her story? People who could help without making her situation worse?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She's scared that if she reports it, and they don't believe her, her stepdad will get angry and hurt her mom or her brother. He's already threatened to do that if anyone finds out about their family business. Sarah felt the familiar anger that came with hearing about adults who terrorized children into silence. These predators knew exactly how to manipulate their victims, using threats against loved ones to maintain control. "Your friend is very brave for wanting to protect her family," Sarah said. "But she shouldn't have to carry that burden alone." By now, several other passengers had noticed their quiet conversation. Rebecca, who had defended Sarah earlier, was watching from a few seats away with obvious concern. The middle-aged woman who had initially been suspicious of Sarah was also listening, though she was trying to pretend she wasn't. Jessica wiped her eyes and looked directly at Sarah. "Could someone like you actually help her? I mean, really help, not just make more problems?" Sarah considered how to answer honestly without making promises she might not be able to keep. Every case was different, and there were no guarantees in her line of work. "The first step would be documenting everything," Sarah explained. "Photos of any injuries, dates, and times of incidents. Any witnesses who might have seen or heard something. The more evidence there is, the harder it becomes for people to dismiss the situation." Jessica nodded, absorbing this information. What if there aren't any witnesses? What if it's just her word against his? Then, we look for other evidence. Abusers rarely limit themselves to one victim. Often there are patterns of behavior that can be uncovered if someone knows where to look. Sarah pulled out one of her business cards and handed it to Jessica. "If your friend ever decides she's ready to get help, she can call me. Even if it's just to talk through her options without committing to anything." Jessica stared at the card for a long moment. What if she's not really my friend? What if it's actually me? Sarah's heart ached for this brave girl who was finally ready to ask for help. Then, I would tell you that you deserve to be safe, and that there are people who will believe you and fight for you. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the front of the bus. Another passenger had stood up and was addressing everyone loudly. "I've been listening to all of this," announced a well-dressed man in his 50s, "and I think it's time someone said what we're all thinking." Sarah tensed, expecting another criticism of her methods or her character. But the man's next words surprised everyone. "This young lady," he said, gesturing towards Sarah, "represents what's best about people who work in social services. She's willing to put herself on the line to protect children, even when it means bending rules that don't make sense." He turned to address Jessica directly. "And you, young woman, are incredibly brave for speaking up about a dangerous situation. Too many adults would rather pretend these problems don't exist than deal with the uncomfortable reality." The man pulled out his own business card and handed it to Sarah. "I'm David Thompson. I'm a family law attorney, and I specialize in cases involving child abuse and custody issues. If you ever need legal support for one of your cases, please don't hesitate to call me." Sarah was stunned by this unexpected offer of help. "Thank you, but I should mention that I can't afford high-end legal fees on a social worker's salary." David smiled. "Who said anything about fees? I do pro bono work for cases involving child protection. It's my way of giving back to the community." Rebecca stood up from her seat again. "Since we're all sharing, I should mention that I'm a trauma counselor specializing in adolescent therapy. If either of you needs someone to talk to teenagers who have been through abuse, I'd be happy to help." Jessica looked amazed as more passengers began offering assistance. The elderly man who had been critical earlier apologized for jumping to conclusions. The young mother offered to provide a safe house if any teenage girls needed temporary shelter. Even the bus driver spoke up to say that his wife ran a non-profit organization that provided clothing and school supplies to kids in crisis. What had started as an embarrassing and invasive bag search had somehow transformed into an impromptu support network for child protection work. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the generosity and understanding of these strangers. "This is incredible," Jessica said, looking around at all the people who had offered to help. "I never realized there were so many adults who actually cared about kids like me." Sarah understood exactly what Jessica meant. When you're trapped in an abusive situation, it can feel like you're completely alone in the world. The idea that strangers would go out of their way to help can seem impossible to believe. "There are more people who care than you might think," Sarah told Jessica. "The problem is that the caring people and the people who need help often don't know how to find each other." David the attorney nodded in agreement. "That's exactly why networking like this is so important. We all have different skills and resources, but we're all working toward the same goal of protecting vulnerable children." As the bus approached Milwaukee, Sarah realized that something remarkable had happened during this journey. What could have been a career-damaging incident had instead become an opportunity to build connections and educate people about child protection issues. Jessica had decided to file a formal report about her home situation, with Rebecca agreeing to provide counseling support and David offering legal representation if needed. The other passengers had exchanged contact information and were making plans to volunteer with local organizations that helped at-risk youth. "You know what the most amazing part of all this is?" Jessica said to Sarah as they prepared to get off the bus. "What's that?" "A few hours ago, I was planning to run away and live on the streets rather than go home tonight. Now I have a whole team of people ready to help me find a real solution to my problems." Sarah smiled, thinking about how this connected to Maya's situation as well. Both girls had been failed by the traditional systems that were supposed to protect them, but both had found hope through people who were willing to work outside those systems when necessary. The bus pulled into the Milwaukee station, and passengers began gathering their belongings. Sarah was surprised when several people approached her to shake hands and thank her for the work she did. "I never really understood what social workers and investigators like you actually deal with," admitted the woman who had initially been suspicious of Sarah's bag. "I'm sorry for judging you before I knew the facts." As Sarah stepped off the bus, she reflected on how the day had unfolded. Her bag had been searched in full view of dozens of strangers, her private life had been exposed, and her professional methods had been questioned. But, through it all, her true nature had indeed been revealed. She wasn't a perfect person who never made mistakes or bent rules. She was someone who cared deeply about protecting children and was willing to take personal risks to do what she believed was right. Most importantly, she was someone who understood that real change happened when people worked together, even if they were just strangers on a bus who decided to care about each other's problems. Walking toward her aunt's house, Sarah pulled out her phone to call Maya. The teenager would be relieved to know that her grandmother's jewelry was still safe, and that Sarah had found even more people willing to help ensure Maya never had to return to an abusive home. Sometimes the most important work happened in the most unexpected places. Today, that place had been a Greyhound bus where a bag search had turned into a community of people committed to protecting children. Sarah couldn't have planned a better outcome if she had tried.